I spent 3 long weeks sitting beside my sister's hospital bed, praying quietly for one more day with her. Every morning, I held her hand while the machines hummed softly around us. By the time she passed, I felt hollow inside. I was exhausted, grieving, and ready to return home to the little house my husband and I spent 40 years building together. But when my taxi turned onto my street, something felt wrong immediately. There was a large white sign standing in my front yard. Sold. For a moment, I thought I was looking at the wrong house. My hands started shaking as I stepped out onto the curb. Then I noticed the strangers walking across my porch like they belonged there. The flower pots I planted last spring were gone. Even the curtains in my living room had changed. I hurried to the front door and tried my key. It would not fit. That was when my daughter-in-law opened the door, with a calm smile on her face. "You're back earlier than expected," she said softly. I stared at her, unable to speak. Then she folded her arms and quietly said the words that changed my life forever. "We sold the house." Before I continue, dear friends, I just want to thank you for spending a little time with me today. Stories like this are never easy to tell, but sometimes sharing our pain helps someone else feel less alone. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about family, forgiveness, and quiet strength, I hope you like this video and subscribe to the channel. My name is Lorraine, and at 68 years old, I believed my hardest days were already behind me. I lived quietly in the retirement home my late husband and I built together, surrounded by memories, routine, and the people I trusted most. My older sister Diane had always been the strong one between the two of us. Even when we were children, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made everyone around her feel safe. She was only 4 years older than me, but all my life, I followed her the way little sisters do. She taught me how to braid my hair, how to bake peach pie without burning the crust, and how to calm myself whenever life felt too heavy. So when I received the phone call from the hospital saying her condition had suddenly worsened, my heart dropped immediately. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed tightly against my ear while the kettle screamed softly behind me. For a few seconds, I could not even answer the nurse. I just stared out the window at my garden while fear slowly settled into my chest. "She's asking for you," the nurse said gently. That sentence alone was enough. I packed a small suitcase that same afternoon. My son Daniel offered to drive me to Diane's town since it was nearly 4 hours away. My daughter-in-law Vanessa insisted she would help watch the house while I was gone. At the time, her words comforted me. Now, when I think back on that moment, I hear them very differently. The drive to the hospital felt longer than any road trip I had ever taken. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Daniel kept both hands tightly on the steering wheel. He looked tired, nervous even. I asked him if everything was all right at home. "Oh, you know," he said with a weak smile, "just bills and work stress." I nodded quietly. Everybody seemed stressed these days. When we finally arrived at the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee hit me the moment the elevator doors opened. Diane's room was near the end of a quiet hallway. I could already hear the faint rhythm of machines before I stepped inside. And when I saw her lying there, my knees nearly gave out beneath me. My sister looked so small. Her silver hair rested softly against the pillow, and her hands, once so full of life, looked thin and fragile beneath the blankets. But when she opened her eyes and saw me standing there, she smiled. "There you are," she whispered. I sat beside her immediately and held her hand between both of mine. For the next several days, that little hospital room became my entire world. The mornings were always the hardest. Nurses came and went quietly while pale sunlight slipped through the blinds. Diane would usually still be asleep, and I would sit there listening to the machines beep softly beside her bed. Sometimes I talked to her even when she could not answer. I told her stories about my garden, about the birds nesting near my porch, about old memories from our childhood that still made me laugh after all these years. One afternoon, she opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Remember when you tried to cut your own hair?" she asked weakly. I laughed so suddenly that tears filled my eyes. "You told Mama the dog did it," I replied. Diane chuckled softly before coughing into the blanket. Moments like that became precious to me. Tiny pieces of normal life floating inside so much sadness. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed constantly. Most of the messages came from Vanessa. At first. They seemed harmless. Hope your sister is feeling better. Don't worry about things at home. Daniel and I are handling everything. But after a while, the messages began changing. Do you know where you keep the insurance papers? Where's the folder with the property documents? Do you still have that old safe key? I remember staring at one message for a long moment before answering. I told myself she was only trying to help. Grief makes people ignore things they normally would question. One evening, after Diane had fallen asleep, I stepped outside the hospital for fresh air. The parking lot was cold and damp from recent rain. I wrapped my sweater tightly around myself and called Daniel. He sounded distracted when he answered. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah. He replied quickly. Just busy. In the background, I could hear Vanessa talking loudly about something I could not fully understand. Then I heard one sentence clearly. If we wait too long, we'll lose the opportunity. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. What opportunity? I asked softly. Daniel hesitated. Oh, nothing important. Just work stuff. I wanted to ask more questions. But at that moment, I looked back through the hospital window and saw Diane lying there alone in bed. Suddenly, nothing else felt important. Over the next week, my sister's condition became worse. Some days she barely spoke at all. I spent hours rubbing lotion onto her dry hands or brushing her hair gently away from her face. Late at night, when the hallways became quiet, she would sometimes whisper fears she never shared with anyone else. I'm scared, Lorraine, she admitted one night. I squeezed her hand tighter. I know, I whispered back. I don't want to leave you alone. That sentence broke something inside me. Because the truth was, I was scared too. After losing my husband 8 years earlier, Diane had become the last person who truly remembered every chapter of my life. She remembered me before the gray hair, before the wrinkles, before the funerals and hospital visits and lonely mornings. She remembered the young version of me. One afternoon, while rain slid slowly down the hospital windows, Diane suddenly looked at me very seriously. You still own that house fully in your name, right? She asked quietly. I blinked in surprise. Yes, I said softly. Why? She relaxed slightly against the pillow. Good, she whispered. Your husband was always careful about protecting you. At the time, I thought it was simply an old woman's worry. I had no idea how important those words would soon become. 2 days later, Diane passed away peacefully just before sunrise. I was holding her hand when it happened. The room became impossibly still afterward. No dramatic moment, no loud sound, just silence. I sat beside her for nearly an hour after the nurses left. I kept expecting her to open her eyes again. Part of me still does. By the time I packed my suitcase to return home, I felt emotionally numb. My body ached from exhaustion, and my chest felt heavy with grief. All I wanted was to go home. I wanted my own bed, my own kitchen, my husband's old chair by the fireplace. I wanted the safety of familiar walls. While I mourned my sister, as Daniel drove me back home that morning, I stared quietly out the window the entire ride. The sky was gray and heavy above the highway, and deep inside me, without fully understanding why, I suddenly felt afraid to open my own front door. The closer we got to my neighborhood, the quieter Daniel became. At first, I thought he was simply tired from the long drive. His hand stayed tight on the steering wheel, and every now and then he cleared his throat nervously like he wanted to say something but could not find the courage. I sat beside him silently, holding Diane's small silver bracelet in my lap. The grief still felt fresh and unreal. Every few minutes, I caught myself thinking about calling her before remembering she was gone. When we finally turned onto my street, something inside me immediately felt wrong. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was the strange stillness hanging in the air, or maybe it was the fact that Daniel suddenly stopped, making eye contact with me. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a black SUV parked near the curb. I did not recognize it. Two men stood near my porch speaking quietly while holding clipboards. For a second, I wondered if they were delivery workers. Then I noticed the lockbox hanging from my front door. My stomach tightened instantly. "What's that?" I asked softly. Daniel swallowed hard. I'm not sure. But his voice sounded unconvincing. The front yard looked different too. My flower pots were gone. The bird feeder my husband built years ago had disappeared. Even the porch swing cushions had been replaced with newer ones I had never seen before. It no longer felt like my home. One of the men glanced toward me, awkwardly before quickly looking away. That was when I noticed the sign near the edge of the lawn. Sold. The word blurred in front of my eyes. I opened the car door slowly and stepped onto the driveway, barely feeling the ground beneath my feet. My suitcase tipped sideways beside me as I stared at the sign moving gently in the wind. "No," I whispered. Daniel hurried out behind me. "Mom, what is this?" I asked, turning toward him. His face had gone pale. Before he could answer, the front door opened. Vanessa stepped outside wearing soft beige clothes and a calm expression that instantly made my chest tighten. She did not look surprised to see me. If anything, she looked irritated. "You're home," she said quietly. I stared at her for several long seconds. Then I walked toward the porch. "What is happening?" I asked. Vanessa folded her arms across her chest. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Those words hit me harder than shouting ever could have. I looked past her shoulder into the house and immediately noticed things were missing. The hallway table was gone. The family photos near the staircase had disappeared. Brown moving boxes sat stacked against the living room wall. My heart began pounding painfully. "You went inside my house?" I whispered. Vanessa let out a slow breath like I was being unreasonable. "We had to prepare for staging." I blinked at her. "Staging?" Daniel finally stepped forward nervously. "Mom, we were going to explain everything." I turned toward him slowly. "Explain what?" Neither of them answered right away, and somehow, that silence told me everything before the words ever came. Vanessa spoke first. "The house sold faster than expected." For a moment, the world around me seemed to disappear. I heard distant traffic somewhere down the street, wind moving through the trees, a dog barking far away, but none of it felt real. "What do you mean sold?" I asked quietly. Vanessa rubbed her forehead impatiently. "Lorraine, this house was too large for you anyway. The market was strong, and honestly, it didn't make financial sense keeping all this tied up in property." I stared at her in disbelief. My husband had built that home with his own hands. We spent decades paying for it slowly, room by room, repair by repair, birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, hospital recoveries, funerals, anniversaries. Every piece of my life existed inside those walls. And she was speaking about it like it was a stock investment. "You sold my home while I was burying my sister?" I asked softly. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. "We were trying to help." Help. That word almost made me laugh. I turned toward Daniel again, desperate for him to deny everything. But he lowered his eyes toward the driveway. That hurt more than anything else. "You knew," I whispered. His voice cracked slightly. "We thought maybe you could move into something smaller, maybe closer to us. Closer to them. The same people, standing in front of me after secretly selling my house." I suddenly felt dizzy. I reached for the porch railing to steady myself while grief and shock crashed together inside my chest. Diane had only been gone for 2 days. 2 days. And now this. Vanessa stepped aside slightly. "Your things are mostly packed already," she said. "We tried to organize everything carefully." I looked into the living room. Again, cardboard boxes covered the floor. My husband's old recliner was gone. The blanket Diane knitted for me years earlier sat folded carelessly inside a plastic bin. I felt physically sick. Without asking permission, I walked past Vanessa and entered the house. The air smelled unfamiliar, like fresh paint and perfume. Someone had removed the family photographs from the walls. Empty spaces remained where memories used to hang. Even my kitchen looked different. My dishes were wrapped in newspaper. Cabinet doors stood open. It looked like strangers had invaded my life. I slowly walked toward the fireplace. The framed picture of my husband was missing from the mantel. That was the moment my composure finally cracked. "Where is his photograph?" I asked weakly. Vanessa hesitated. I packed it safely. I closed my eyes briefly. For 40 years, that photograph had greeted me every single morning, and now it was buried inside a moving box like clutter. Behind me, Daniel spoke quietly. "Mom, please understand. We're struggling financially right now." I turned around slowly. "So you sold my house?" "No," Vanessa interrupted quickly. "Technically, we facilitated the sale." The coldness in her tone stunned me. I looked at her carefully then, really looked at her, and for the first time, I realized something terrible. This was not a mistake made in panic. This had been planned. Every text message, every question about paperwork, every fake gesture of concern while I sat beside my dying sister, all of it had been preparation. A knock suddenly came at the open front door. An older woman from across the street stood there nervously holding several printed papers in her hands. "Mrs. Harper had been my neighbor for nearly 20 years. I thought you should have these," she said quietly. I took the papers from her trembling hands, and my entire body went cold. It was an online property listing for my home, my address, pictures of my bedroom, my kitchen, my garden, and at the bottom of the final page was a signature. My signature, except it was not mine. I stared at it for several seconds while my breathing became shallow. "That's not my handwriting," I whispered. Nobody answered. I looked up slowly at Daniel and Vanessa. Daniel looked terrified, but Vanessa simply stood there in silence, and in that moment, standing inside the hollow shell of the home I once loved, something inside me changed. The grief was still there. The heartbreak was still there. But beneath it, something colder began to grow, because this was no misunderstanding. This was betrayal. And deep down, I suddenly realized they were hiding far more than a simple house sale. That night, I did not sleep in my own home. Even now, saying those words still hurts me. After the argument on the porch, Vanessa told me the buyers would officially take possession within days and that it would be less confusing if I stayed somewhere else temporarily. She said it so calmly, like she was discussing weather. Instead of throwing a grieving widow out of the house she spent most of her life building, Daniel offered to pay for a motel nearby. I almost refused out of pride, but I was too emotionally exhausted to fight anymore. So I packed a few clothes from one of the half-filled boxes in my bedroom while strangers walked through my house measuring windows and discussing renovations. One young couple stood in my kitchen whispering excitedly about knocking down walls. I wanted to scream at them to leave. Instead, I quietly carried my suitcase to Daniel's car. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. There was a small lamp near the bed that flickered every few minutes. I sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing my coat, while Diane's condolence cards rested unopened beside me. Everything felt unreal. 2 days earlier, I had been holding my sister's hand as she took her final breath. Now I was homeless. I remember staring at the motel curtains for hours that first night. My mind kept replaying small details I had ignored. Vanessa asking about legal documents, her sudden interest in my insurance papers, Daniel sounding nervous during phone calls, the lockbox on my front door. I felt foolish for missing the signs, but grief clouds the mind. When someone you love is dying, you stop noticing danger around you. Your whole heart becomes focused on surviving one painful day at a time. The next morning, I called an attorney. His name was Mr. Whitaker, an older man my husband once trusted years ago when we updated our estate paperwork. The moment I explained what happened, his tone became serious. "Mrs. Bennett," he said carefully, "did you personally sign any paperwork authorizing sale of your property?" "No," I answered immediately. Did you grant power of attorney to your son or daughter-in-law? Never. There was a long pause on the line. Then he quietly said something that made my stomach tighten. You need to come into my office today. By noon, I was sitting across from him holding a cup of untouched coffee while he reviewed county records on his computer. Papers covered his desk in messy stacks. The deeper he looked, the more concerned he became. Finally, he removed his glasses slowly. There's a power of attorney document attached to the filing, he explained. My chest tightened. What does that mean? It means someone submitted legal paperwork claiming authority to act on your behalf. I stared at him in disbelief, but I never signed anything. I know, he replied gently. He turned the monitor toward me. There on the screen was my name beside a shaky electronic signature. I felt physically ill. That isn't mine, I whispered. Mr. Whitaker nodded slowly. I didn't think so. He printed several pages and slid them carefully across the desk. Every page carried signs of rushed filing. Dates overlapped strangely. Certain notarization sections looked incomplete. This was done very quickly, he said, almost recklessly. I looked down at the documents again. My own family had forged legal authority over my life, while I was sitting in a hospital saying goodbye to my sister. The realization hurt in ways I still struggle to explain. Mr. Whitaker continued reading, quietly before frowning again. There's more. I looked up anxiously. The property was sold to an investment group, connected to rapid home flipping operations. I blinked in confusion. What does that mean? It means these weren't ordinary buyers, he explained. These companies move fast. They buy homes below market value, renovate them quickly, then resell for profit. Suddenly everything made sense. The rush timeline, the staging, the strangers measuring my walls before I had even returned home. Vanessa had not simply sold my house. She had rushed it into a predatory investment deal. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead. Why would she do this? Mr. Whitaker hesitated carefully. Financial desperation makes people justify terrible choices. That evening, Daniel finally came to the motel alone. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and his clothes were wrinkled like he had not slept properly in days. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly sat down near the window. I'm sorry, he whispered. The sadness in his voice almost broke me. I looked at my son, the little boy I once rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, and suddenly I barely recognized the man sitting in front of me. How long did you know? I asked softly. Daniel lowered his head. A few weeks. I closed my eyes briefly. Weeks. While Diane was dying. While I trusted them. We were drowning in debt, he admitted quietly. Credit cards, medical bills. Vanessa said selling the house could solve everything. So you decided my life was the easiest thing to sacrifice? No, he said quickly. That's not what I wanted. But you let it happen. His silence answered for him. For a long moment, all I could hear was the buzzing motel air conditioner filling the room between us. Then Daniel spoke again. She kept saying the house was too big for one person, that she'd eventually move anyway. She said we were protecting your future. I laughed softly then, not because anything was funny, because sometimes heartbreak becomes so large that laughter slips out by accident. That house, I whispered, is your father's fingerprints in the wood floors. It's your childhood height marks behind the pantry door. It's every Christmas morning we ever shared. Daniel began crying quietly. And seeing him cry hurt me almost as much as the betrayal itself, because beneath all the anger, he was still my son, broken, weak, manipulated, but still mine. After he left, I sat alone for a long time staring at the old family photograph inside my wallet. Then just before sunset, my phone rang. It was Mr. Whitaker again. His voice sounded very different this time. Sharp. Focused. Mrs. Bennett, he said carefully, I found something important in your original property deed. I sat upright immediately. What is it? There's a protective trust clause your late husband added years ago during refinancing. My heart skipped. A trust clause? Yes, he replied. According to this document, the property cannot legally be sold without direct physical notarized approval from the primary resident. I blinked slowly. What does that mean? It means electronic authorization alone is invalid. I could barely breathe. Mr. Whitaker continued. There's also biometric identity protection attached to the updated deed records. Silence filled the room. Then he said the sentence that changed everything, Mrs. Bennett. Legally speaking, they sold a house they never had the authority to sell. For the first time since returning home, I felt something other than grief. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. I slowly looked out the motel window as evening sunlight faded across the parking lot. Vanessa thought paperwork could erase 40 years of my life, but my husband, even after all these years gone, had quietly protected me one final time, and deep inside, I realized the story was far from over. The morning after Mr. Whitaker called me about the trust clause, I woke up feeling something I had not felt in weeks. Strength. Not anger. Not revenge. Just a quiet kind of strength. For days, I had felt like my entire life was slipping away while I stood helplessly watching it happen. But now, for the first time since Diane died, I finally understood something important. I was not powerless. My husband had protected me long before any of this began. I sat on the edge of the motel bed holding the original property deed Mr. Whitaker had recovered from his office archives. The paper was old and slightly worn at the edges, but my husband's signature rested clearly across the bottom. Seeing his handwriting again nearly brought me to tears. Harold had always been careful with legal matters. Years ago, after hearing stories about elderly homeowners being manipulated out of property, he insisted we had extra protections to the house deed. At the time, I thought he was overly cautious. Now I realized he had been trying to protect me from exactly this kind of betrayal. By late afternoon, Mr. Whitaker arrived at the motel with 2 uniformed police officers. Their presence made everything suddenly feel very real. We're going to the property now, he explained calmly. The investment group intends to begin moving contractors inside this evening. My stomach tightened. The thought of strangers tearing apart my home while Diane's death was still fresh felt unbearable. During the drive, rain clouds gathered overhead again. I sat quietly in the back seat staring out the window while the police cruiser followed behind us. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. As we turned onto my street, I immediately saw moving trucks parked outside my house. Several workers carried boxes toward the front door while 2 men in expensive jackets stood near the driveway reviewing paperwork. One woman pointed toward my living room window while discussing renovation plans. They were already treating my home like a business project. I felt sick. Mr. Whitaker stepped out of the car first. The police officers followed closely behind him. One of the men near the driveway frowned. Immediately, "Can we help you?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," Mr. Whitaker replied calmly. "You can start by stopping all activity on this property immediately." The workers slowly paused. The man holding the clipboard looked irritated. "We purchased this property legally," he replied. "Closing documents are already filed." Mr. Whitaker opened his briefcase carefully and removed several papers. "The sale is invalid," he said firmly. "Fraudulent power of attorney. Forged authorization, violation of protected trust conditions." The man's expression changed instantly. "What?" By then, Vanessa had appeared at the front door. The moment she saw the police officers, all the color drained from her face. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then she forced a weak smile. "Lorraine," she said carefully, "you didn't need to do all this." I looked at her standing in my doorway and suddenly noticed how exhausted she looked. Her hair was messy. Her hands shook slightly at her sides. But even then, I could not understand how she had crossed such a terrible line so easily. "You forged legal documents," I said quietly. Vanessa's eyes darted toward the police officers. "I was trying to help the family." One of the investors stepped forward angrily. What is she talking about? We already wired the deposit, Mr. Whitaker handed him copies of the trust clause paperwork. As the man read through the pages, his face hardened. This says biometric confirmation was required. He snapped. Correct, Mr. Whitaker replied, which means the transaction should never have been approved. The second investor suddenly turned toward Vanessa. You told us all approvals were secured. Vanessa began panicking visibly. They were supposed to be, she stammered. Daniel said, don't drag my son into this. I interrupted softly. My voice remained calm, but inside my chest everything hurt. Neighbors had slowly begun gathering outside nearby homes. Curtains moved. Front doors opened quietly. People whispered while watching from sidewalks. Humiliation spread across Vanessa's face as reality finally started closing around her. One of the officers stepped forward professionally. Ma'am, he said, at this point we are investigating possible fraud and unlawful property transfer. Vanessa's breathing became uneven. You don't understand, she whispered desperately. We already spent part of the deposit. The investors looked furious now. How much? One demanded. She hesitated. And that silence answered everything. The taller investor cursed under his breath and stepped away toward his phone immediately. Meanwhile, moving workers quietly began carrying boxes back toward the truck. The entire atmosphere shifted within minutes. What had looked like a successful property transfer suddenly collapsed into confusion and legal panic. Daniel arrived shortly afterward. The moment he stepped out of his car and saw police vehicles parked outside the house, his face crumbled completely. He looked at me with tears already forming in his eyes. Mom, I could barely look at him. Not because I hated him, because I loved him too much. Love makes betrayal hurt differently. Vanessa hurried toward him immediately. Tell them this was your idea too, she whispered harshly. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. What? You said we needed the money. His face tightened painfully. I never agreed to forging documents. The silence that followed felt heavy. Even the neighbors stopped whispering. Vanessa looked around desperately, like someone searching for an escape that no longer existed. Then suddenly, right there in the front yard, she broke down crying. I was trying to save us, she sobbed. Nobody understands how bad things were. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then I remembered sitting beside Diane's hospital bed while Vanessa searched my drawers and filed paperwork behind my back. I remembered the changed locks, the packed boxes, my husband's photograph hidden away like meaningless clutter, and the sympathy faded. One officer quietly informed the workers that no one would be entering the property until the investigation concluded. Another officer documented the current condition of the home while Mr. Whitaker spoke privately with the investors. Eventually, one of the officers handed me a new set of keys. Ma'am, he said gently, you are legally recognized as sole resident and owner of this property. My hands trembled as I accepted them. Those keys felt heavier than they ever had before. Slowly, I walked toward the front door. For a moment, I hesitated on the porch, the same porch where Harold used to drink coffee every Sunday morning, the same porch where Diane once sat laughing during summer cookouts, the same porch where my own family betrayed me. Then I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Again, boxes still lined the hallway. Furniture sat moved out of place. Cabinet doors remained open from strangers searching through my life. But despite the mess, it was still my home. I slowly walked toward the living room. And there, pushed awkwardly near the corner, sat Harold's old chair. The sight of it finally broke something inside me. For days, I had stayed strong because survival demanded it. But now the fear, grief, exhaustion, and heartbreak came crashing down all at once. I lowered myself into that chair and cried harder than I had even cried at Diane's funeral. Outside, I could still hear distant voices and police radios, but inside the house, all I could feel was the unbearable weight of losing trust in the people I once loved most. And as evening darkness slowly filled the rooms around me, I realized something painful but true. Greed had already destroyed far more than money. It had destroyed a family. The weeks after the investigation began felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way life becomes quiet after something breaks beyond repair. Police reports were filed. Lawyers made phone calls every day. The investment group threatened lawsuits against Vanessa for fraud and misrepresentation. County officials opened a formal investigation into the forged power of attorney documents, and through all of it, I remained inside my home trying to piece my life back together one room at a time. At first, I barely had the energy to unpack anything. Some mornings I simply sat at the kitchen table staring at half-filled boxes while cold tea rested untouched beside me. Grief had settled into every corner of the house. Diane was gone. My family had betrayed me. And somehow, even after getting my home back, nothing felt fully safe anymore. One rainy afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway holding an old family photograph. It had slipped behind one of the moving boxes during all the chaos. The picture showed Daniel at 10 years old sitting on Harold's shoulders in our backyard. Both of them were smiling so widely that their eyes nearly disappeared. I traced my fingers gently across the photograph. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Where had that little boy gone? Because the man who stood silently while his wife sold my home felt like a stranger. Still, he was my son, and that truth made everything harder. A few days later, Daniel came to visit alone. When I opened the front door, he looked exhausted. His shoulders sagged heavily beneath his coat, and his eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without answering. The house felt awkward around him now, like the walls themselves remembered what had happened. Daniel sat carefully at the kitchen table while I made coffee neither of us really wanted. Rain tapped softly against the windows as silence filled the room between us. Finally, he spoke. "Vanessa moved out." I paused near the counter. "Where did she go?" "With her sister." His voice sounded empty. I carried the coffee mugs to the table and sat across from him quietly. For a long moment, he stared down into his cup, then the tears came. "I ruined everything," he whispered, hearing my grown son cry. Like that shattered something inside me. Daniel covered his face with trembling hands. "We were drowning in debt," he admitted. "Credit cards, medical loans, missed payments." Vanessa kept saying the house could solve all of it. I listened silently. She convinced herself it was temporary at first. He continued weakly. "She said we'd help you relocate somewhere smaller and invest the rest carefully." Then everything started moving too fast. "Fast enough to forge my name?" I asked softly. Daniel closed his eyes. "I know." The shame on his face was impossible to miss. And despite everything, part of me still wanted to comfort him the way mothers do when their children are hurting. But betrayal changes love. It does not always destroy it. Sometimes, it simply wounds it so deeply that it never sounds the same again. Daniel looked up slowly. "I should have stopped her." "Yes," I replied quietly. "You should have." Those words hung heavily between us. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. "I kept thinking we could fix it before you came home," he whispered. Then Diane died, and suddenly everything became real. At the mention of Diane, my chest tightened painfully again. As so much loss had happened all at once that my heart barely knew where to place the grief anymore. "I trusted you," I said finally. Daniel nodded slowly while tears slid down his face. "I know. No excuses. No arguments. Just truth." And strangely, that hurt even more. After he left that evening, I walked slowly through the house, turning on small lamps one by one. The familiar warm glow softened the emptiness slightly. I paused in the hallway beside the pantry door where Harold used to mark Daniel's height every birthday. Tiny pencil lines still covered the wood. Age 5, age 8, age 12. I pressed my fingers gently against them and closed my eyes. Children grow older. Families change. But mothers never stop remembering who their children once were. Over the following month, legal consequences continued building around Vanessa. The investors formally sued her for financial damages after learning part of their deposit money had already been spent. The fraudulent paperwork triggered possible criminal charges. Her real estate contact reportedly cut all communication once investigators became involved. Word spread quickly through the community. People who once attended family dinners with us now whispered quietly in grocery store aisles. Some blamed Vanessa entirely, others blamed Daniel too. But I stopped listening after a while, because none of it gave me peace. One afternoon, Mrs. Harper from across the street brought over a small peach pie and sat with me in the garden for nearly an hour. "You've handled all this with grace," she said gently. I looked down at my hands. "No," I answered honestly. "I've just been too tired to fall apart properly." She reached over and squeezed my arm softly, and somehow, that simple kindness nearly made me cry. Healing did not happen all at once. It came slowly, quietly, like sunlight returning. After a long winter storm, I began restoring the house little by little. I rehung family photographs. I unpacked Harold's old books. I planted fresh flowers near the porch where the sold sign once stood, and in the living room, I framed my favorite picture of Diane smiling beside me during one of our last summer picnics together. Sometimes, I still talk to her while watering the garden. I think grief makes people continue conversations long after funerals. And then one evening, several months later, Daniel returned again. This time, he stood on the porch holding a small cardboard box. "I found these while packing," he said quietly. "Inside were old handwritten letters between Harold and me from the early years of our marriage." I smiled sadly as I touched the faded envelopes. "Your father never threw anything away," I whispered. Daniel gave a weak smile. For a moment, things almost felt normal again. Almost. Then he looked at me carefully and asked the question I knew had been living inside him for months. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" The honesty in his voice broke my heart. I looked at my son standing there beneath the porch light, older and sadder than I had ever seen him before. And I answered with the only truth I had left. "I will always love you, Daniel," I said softly. "But trust heals slower than love does." Tears filled his eyes again. He nodded quietly because deep down, he understood. Some damage cannot be erased with apologies. Some wounds leave scars that stay tender forever. That night, after he left, I sat alone on the porch listening to crickets sing softly in the dark. The house behind me finally felt like home again. Not because everything was fixed, but because I survived what tried to destroy me. And sometimes, survival itself becomes its own kind of quiet victory. Almost a year has passed since the day I came home and found that sold sign standing in my front yard. Sometimes it still feels unreal. There are mornings when I wake up, walk quietly into the kitchen, and half expect strangers to be standing there measuring the walls again. Trauma has a strange way of lingering inside ordinary moments. Even after the danger passes, part of your heart keeps waiting for another loss. But little by little, this house has begun breathing again. The garden came back first. I think Harold would smile if he could see it now. After everything happened, the flower beds were neglected for months. The roses had wilted. Weeds climbed around the porch steps. Even the bird feeder hung crooked and empty near the oak tree. One cool spring morning, I carried gardening gloves outside and decided to start over. Not because I suddenly felt strong, but because grief becomes heavier when you stop caring for the things you love. So I worked slowly. Some days I planted flowers. Some days I simply sat in the dirt and cried quietly while holding Diane's old sun hat in my lap. Healing is not graceful the way people imagine. Sometimes healing looks like an exhausted woman watering roses while trying not to fall apart. But eventually, small signs of life returned. Tiny green stems pushed through the soil. Birds returned to the feeder again. The porch began feeling warm instead of haunted. And somehow, as the garden healed, I began healing too, inside the house. I restored things carefully. I rehung every family photograph exactly where it belonged. Harold's chair returned beside the fireplace where it had always been. Diane's picture now rests on the piano with fresh flowers beside it every Sunday morning. Sometimes I sit there with a cup of tea and speak to both of them, softly, not because I expect answers, but because love does not disappear simply because someone is gone. Daniel continued visiting from time to time. The first few months remained awkward between us. Conversations felt careful and fragile, like both of us were afraid to touch certain memories too directly. But slowly, honesty began replacing silence. One afternoon, while helping me repair the porch railing, Daniel suddenly stopped working and looked down at his hands. I still don't understand how I let things go that far, he admitted quietly. I tightened one of the screws carefully before answering. Fear changes people, I said softly, especially fear about money. He nodded slowly. But that's not an excuse. No, I replied. It isn't. The wind moved gently through the trees around us. Then, Daniel looked toward the garden and whispered something that nearly broke my heart. Dad would be ashamed of me. I set the screwdriver down immediately. Your father loved you, I said firmly. Never forget that. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. And in that moment, I realized something important. The damage Vanessa caused did not only hurt me. It shattered Daniel too. He lost his marriage, his reputation, his sense of self-respect, and worst of all, he lost the peaceful trust that once existed inside our family. Greed always takes more than people expect. As for Vanessa, I have not seen her in many months. The legal consequences became very serious after investigators uncovered the forged documents and financial transfers connected to the house sale. Last I heard, she moved several towns away to live near relatives after the lawsuits drained most of their savings. For a long time, I carried anger toward her inside my chest. Not loud anger, quiet anger. The kind that keeps replaying painful memories late at night, but eventually, even that began fading. Not because what she did was acceptable. It never will be, but because carrying bitterness year after year only poisons the person holding it. And after everything I survived, I no longer wanted my remaining years filled with poison. One rainy evening, Daniel asked me something difficult. Do you think you'll ever forgive her? I stared out the kitchen window for a long moment before answering. I think forgiveness and trust are two different things, I said softly. He nodded quietly. And that was enough. Some relationships can heal, others simply teach us painful lessons before ending forever. These days, life moves much slower again. Most mornings, I wake before sunrise and make coffee in the same little kitchen where Harold once danced with me while breakfast burned on the stove. I water the flowers. I feed the birds. Sometimes I read old letters from Diane while soft music plays in the background. The house feels peaceful again, not untouched by pain, but peaceful. And honestly, I think there's a difference. Pain leaves marks behind, but peace can still exist around those scars. A few weeks ago, Mrs. Harper stopped by with fresh bread and laughed when she saw me repainting the porch bench. You've made this place beautiful again, she said warmly. I smiled and looked around the yard. The sunlight stretched softly across the garden. Wind chimes moved gently near the windows. For the first time in a very long while, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like home. Real home. The kind built slowly through years of love, sacrifice, grief, and survival. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch wrapped in a blanket while evening crickets filled the air, and I found myself thinking about something Diane once told me many years ago. She said, "A home remembers the people who truly loved inside it." Back then, I thought she was simply being sentimental. Now I understand exactly what she meant. Because despite betrayal, despite greed, despite all the legal papers and lies, this house still remembers Harold's laughter. It still remembers Christmas mornings with Daniel racing down the stairs. It still remembers Diane sitting at the kitchen table, drinking tea beside me while rain tapped against the windows, and now, it also remembers that I fought to keep it. If there is one lesson I have learned through all of this, it is this: never confuse kindness with weakness. Many older people spend their lives trusting the people they love most. We assume family would never take advantage of our grief, our loneliness, or our vulnerability. But trust should still be protected wisely. Ask questions. Keep your paperwork safe. Make your wishes legally clear. And most importantly, never feel ashamed for protecting the life you spent decades building. As for me, I still miss Diane every single day. I still miss Harold too. Some grief never fully leaves. But when the morning sunlight pours through my kitchen windows now, I no longer feel broken. I feel grateful. Grateful that my husband protected me long after he was gone. Grateful that I survived betrayal without becoming bitter. And grateful that this old house, the one everyone tried to turn into money, remained exactly what it was, always meant to be: a home.